Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the convertible diamond wrap. So this wrap is essentially a rectangle, and we're going to put buttons along one end of it, and then all the rest of the edges are going to have eyelets in them, or buttonholes, so that you can wear it a whole bunch of different ways and button the buttons into any of those buttonholes that are around the edge. So the first thing you're going to need for this project is the free written pattern, which you will find for free on my blog. See the link in the description box below to get the pattern. Or you can also purchase a large print ad-free printable PDF version of the pattern in my Ravelry store. So you're also going to need some yarn. This is the yarn from the February knit crate, and this is Audine Wools Halo DK. And this is alpaca, merino, and nylon. The colorway I have is called Electric Abalone. And so this is a DK weight yarn, and I have 2 skeins of it here. I also have a size 7 or 4.5 millimeter knitting needle. This is a circular knitting needle, but we're going to be knitting this back and forth, and this is narrow enough that if you want to do this on regular straight needles, you can do that if you want to. But I'm just using a circular needle because that is my preference. You're also going to need a measuring tape for measuring your gauge and for measuring your wrap. You're going to need a yarn needle or blunt tapestry needle for weaving in your ends. And you're going to need some scissors. And what I don't have pictured here that you're also going to need is you're going to need buttons 5/8 of an inch in diameter. And depending on how thick your yarn needle is and how big the holes in your buttons are, if the holes in your buttons are big enough that your smallest yarn needle can pass through those buttonholes, the holes in the buttons I should say, then you won't need this. But if your yarn needle is too big to go through the holes in your buttons, then you're also going to need a large-eyed sewing needle it has a pretty decent size eye, so that you can either feed the yarn through it, or you can use some sewing thread if you'd rather. So now that we have all of our supplies, let's get started knitting. So we're going to start by casting on, and I'm going to use a long tail cast on, but if you have a different cast on that you'd rather use, then go for it. So I'm going to start with my slip knot, and I'm going to start casting on onto my circular needle, and like I said, I'm still knitting back and forth. So just because I'm using a circular needle doesn't mean we're going in the round. I just like to use a circular needle for knitting back and forth. So I'm going to go ahead and cast on a total of 65 stitches. Alright, so now you're going to want to go ahead and double check to make sure you have the correct number of stitches on your needle. Alright, so now that I know for sure I have the correct number of stitches, I have 65 stitches on my needle. Now we're going to go ahead and start knitting. So like I said, we're going to be knitting back and forth in rows. And for rows 1 to 6, we're just going to knit all the way across. So we're going to be knitting basically a little band of garter stitch for the bottom edge. So I'm just going to knit all the way across for each row, and I'm going to do that for a total of 6 rows. Alright, so now that we've finished our garter stitch border right here, this is our first 6 rows. Now we're going to move on to the stitch pattern part. So this edge right here, this little garter stitch section, this is going to be the only edge that doesn't have any buttonholes in it. So all the rest of the edges, the sides and the top edge, will all have buttonholes all the way down so that you can button it different ways and arrange, wear it however you want. So every repeat of our stitch pattern has a buttonhole built into the edge, and it also has a garter stitch edging built into each row. So we're going to start by working row 7, and for row 7 we're going to knit 1. Then we're going to knit 2 together, and to do this we're going to insert the right needle as if to knit into 2 stitches at the same time and knit them together as though they were 1. And then we're going to work a yarn over. So a yarn over is what makes the buttonhole, And the reason we work that knit 2 together is because we are removing a stitch because we're going to add a yarn over, and a yarn over counts as a stitch, but the yarn over creates a hole instead of what looks like a regular stitch. So we decrease a stitch every time we work a yarn over because we're not actually changing the shape of our piece here. So I got my knit 1, my knit 2 together, and then I'm going to yarn over by bringing the yarn from the front of the needle over the top of the needle to the back. And then I'm going to knit 5. And then we're going to work a little repeat sequence across our row most of the way. So now we're going to keep repeating a little sequence of purl 1, knit 7. And then again, purl 1, knit 7. And I'm going to keep repeating that sequence all the way across until we get to the last 9 stitches. All right, so now we have 9 stitches left on the left needle. And we're going to purl 1, knit 5. Then we're going to yarn over. We're going to knit 2 together and knit 1. So that is the end of row 7. Now we're going to work row 8, and row 8 is going to be the next part of our little stitch pattern. And this stitch pattern is going to be making the diamond shapes, or the cross-hatching lines that go across the knitting. So for row 8, we're going to knit 4. And I should mention that when we work into the yarn over, let me back up there real quick. When we work into the yarn over, we just work into it as if it was a regular stitch. We just insert the right needle into the front of it and then knit through it as normal. So I have my knit 4, then I'm going to purl 3. And now we're going to repeat another sequence across this row. So for this row, the sequence is knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and purl 5. So again, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 5. And we're going to keep repeating that across until we have 10 stitches left in the row. All right, so here's the last 10 stitches of my row. Now we're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 3, and knit 4. All right, so now we're going to turn and work row 9. So for row 9, we're going to start by knitting 6. And now we're going to work a sequence of purl 1, knit 3, all the way across until we get to the last 7 stitches. So purl 1, knit 3, purl 1, knit 3, all the way across to the last 7 stitches. All right, so here's the last 7 stitches, and we're going to purl 1 and knit 6. All right, so now we're going to turn and work row 10. So for row 10, we're going to knit 4. Then we're going to purl 1. And our repeat sequence for this row is knit 1, purl 5, knit 1, purl 1. So now we're going to repeat that sequence across to the last 4 stitches. So knit 1, purl 5, knit 1, purl 1. And we're going to repeat that all the way across till we get to the last 4 stitches. All right, so we're down to the last 4 stitches. We're going to knit 4. All right, so now we're going to turn and work row 11. And for row 11, we're going to knit 4 and purl 1. And now we're going to work a little sequence across. And for this sequence, we're going to knit 7 and purl 1. And we're going to repeat that across to the last 4 stitches. So knit 7 and purl 1 all the way across to the last 4 stitches. All right, now we're down to the last 4 stitches and we're going to knit 4. Okay, so now we are at the point where our lines are getting ready to cross right here. So we've made kind of a V shape that goes all the way across. And now we're going to kind of reverse that so that we create the tops of our diamonds. So here's the bottom. Now we're going to create the top part where the lines come together at the top. So to do this, we're going to repeat some of the rows in reverse order. Now that's not as complicated as it sounds because each row is given in its order. So for row 12, we're going to repeat row 10. So we're going to knit 4, and then we're going to purl 1. And then our sequence for this row is to knit 1, purl 5, and then knit 1, purl 1. So again, knit 1, purl 5, knit 1, and purl 1. So we're going to repeat that across to the last 4 stitches. All right, so I'm down to the last 4 stitches and I'm going to knit 4. So now we're going to work row 13, which is to repeat row 9. So we're going to knit 6, and then for this row we're going to repeat the little sequence of purl 1, knit 3 all the way across until we get to the last 7 stitches. So purl 1, knit 3, purl 1, knit 3 across to the last 7 stitches. All right, so I'm down to the last 7 stitches and I'm going to purl 1 and knit 6. All right, so now we're going to turn and work row 14, which is to repeat row 8. So we're going to again knit 4 and purl 3, and then we're going to work the sequence of knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 5, and we're going to repeat that across to the last 10 stitches. So knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 5, across to the last 10 stitches. All right, so now we're down to the last 10 stitches. We're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 3, and knit 4. So that is the last row of our stitch pattern. So this was, we did rows 1 to 6 for the garter edge, and then rows 7 to 14 make up the diamond pattern. And if I lay this down right here, you can see that we have just worked basically the first row of diamonds in our stitch pattern. So those purl stitches on the right side, they create this diamond pattern. So now what we're going to do is we're going to be repeating rows 7 to 14 over and over and over again. So these rows might seem a little bit complicated, but they're really not that hard to do as long as you're paying attention to the pattern, and as long as you can basically count how many stitches you're knitting and purling, then you'll be fine as far as the difficulty of the stitch pattern, because it's really not that difficult to do. But I would highly suggest that if you get the printable version of the pattern, to print it out and use a sticky note or something of that sort to mark which row you're on. So then when you have to set it down and then pick it back up later, you'll know which row you were on, as long as you continue to move the sticky note down to show the next row that you need to do after you finish each row. So for example, if I just finished row 14, for example, then I would move my sticky note back up so that it would show just row 7, and then once I work row 7, I'd move the sticky note down so it shows row 8. So then you always know which row you were just on, and you won't get lost in the pattern as far as, working the wrong row at the wrong time if you have to set it down and then pick it back up later. So like I said, we're going to repeat rows 7 to 14 over and over and over again until the piece is the correct length and until we have repeated that section the correct number of times. So every time we repeat rows 7 to 14, if you remember, row 7 has this little eyelet in the garter stitch edging over here, so that will create one eyelet at the beginning of every section of row 7 to 14. So that's what's going to create our buttonholes along the side edges. So I'm going to continue repeating rows 7 to 14 until my piece is the correct length and has the correct number of repeats. Alright, so now I have repeated rows 7 to 14 another 42 times after I initially worked them. And the way to count how many rows, a good way to count, is that every time we worked row 7, it created another little hole over here along the edge. So this hole right here is the first time we worked it, and then I have another 42 holes along the edge for a total of 43. Now if you're afraid of running out of yarn, then you can go ahead and eliminate the very last repeat of rows 7 to 14 and only work until you have a total of 42 holes in the edge. But that is up to you. If you feel like you have enough yarn to make it through the last repeat before the little edging, then go ahead and try it with the 43rd repeat. If you don't feel comfortable with that, then you can go ahead and stop after you have a total of 42 repeats. So now we're going to work our little edging, and this is where this is kind of going to be another edging that matches the one on the sides, where it has holes all the way across for the buttons. So for row 15, we are just going to knit all the way across, and this is a garter stitch edging, so a lot of the rows for the edging are going to be knit across, but the first one is row 15. We're going to just knit all the way across. Alright, so that's row 15, and now we're going to turn and work row 16, and this is the one with the holes in it. So for row 16, we're going to start by knitting 1, then we're going to knit 2 together, we're going to yarn over, and then we're going to knit 4. Alright, so now we're going to work a little repeat sequence all the way across, and the sequence is to knit 2 together, yarn over, and knit 6. So again, I'm going to knit 2 together, yarn over, and knit 6. And I'm just going to continue doing that all the way across until I get to the last 10 stitches. And now I'm down to the last 10 stitches. So now we're going to knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 5, yarn over, knit 2 together, and knit 1. So that is our row with the eyelets in it, or the holes in it, so that the buttons can go through this edge too. So now for rows 17 to 20, we're going to knit across. So that's a total of 4 rows of just knitting straight across in garter stitch. And as before, we're just going to knit into the yarn over as if it was a regular stitch, just inserting into the front of it and knitting through it. Alright, so now I have finished that very last row, and we're just going to bind off all the way across. We're going to try to bind off loosely so that we don't inhibit the stretch of the edge, but we're just going to bind off all the way across and tie off when we get to the end. Alright, so now that I've bound off all the way across, I'm going to go ahead and cut the yarn, leaving about a 6-inch tail at least, and pull the loop on my needle till the end comes out to tie off. And now we're done with the knitting needles. So here's the yarn I have left. I ran pretty close to the end of my 2 skeins, but like I said, if you're afraid of running out of yarn, just eliminate the very last repeat of rows 7 to 14. So here is the top end that we just finished. This has 9 holes in the end here, in this very last edging. And then there are holes all the way down both sides of these garter stitch edgings. And the very bottom edge, where we started, does not have any holes. And this is because we're going to attach the buttons along this bottom edge that doesn't have any holes. So first of all, now that our project is finished, we want to weave in our ends, and we want to block it, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and weave in my tails, and then I'm going to block my wrap. I'm going to choose to spray block mine. If you don't know how to block your knitting, then you can go and watch my video on that. There's a link to it in the description box. But I'm going to go ahead and block my piece here, and then we're going to sew on the buttons. Alright, so my piece is blocked now, and it lays nice and flat and smooth. And now what we're going to do is sew on the buttons. So in front of me right here is the cast on edge, and the little bit of garter stitch that we did before going into the stitch pattern for this edging right here. So we're going to sew our buttons to this edging, and because it has buttonholes all around all the rest of the edges, then the buttons that go across this edge can connect to any other part of this wrap. So you can customize how you want to wear it any way you want, and you can make it stay by buttoning it together to keep it in position wherever you want to wrap it. So I have 9 buttons here. These are each about 5/8 of an inch in diameter. And you want to make sure that you either have a thin enough yarn needle that can pass through the holes in the button easily, because if you don't, then you'll have to use sewing thread and a sewing needle to attach these buttons. But since my thinnest yarn needle does fit through these holes, I'm going to go ahead and use these buttons and use the yarn to sew them on. So I have a length of the leftover yarn threaded into my tapestry needle here. And we're going to evenly space these 9 buttons across this edge of our wrap. And we're going to use the stitch design to kind of help us position the buttons. And if you notice, all these cross-hatching lines, they come together and they touch to make little V shapes that go up against the garter stitch edge. So every place we have one of those V shapes touching the garter stitch edge, we're going to put a button. So here's the next one over here. We're going to put a button there and there. And then on the corners as well. Like so. So this is going to kind of give you an idea of how we're arranging the buttons. It doesn't matter how many holes your buttons have as long as you have a needle of some sort that can fit through the holes in the buttons. So instead of sewing each of these 9 buttons on with its own piece of yarn, I'm going to do all the buttons with one longer piece of yarn so that I don't have to weave in 18 yarn tails to have one length of yarn for each button. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by attaching this button over here. Then we're going to weave the yarn into the garter stitch fabric across the back until we get to the next place where there's going to be a button, and we'll attach a button right there. Then we will weave our yarn tail through the back of the garter stitch till we get to where the next button should go and put a button there, and so on until we get across to the rest of the buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this button on the corner. I'm going to make all my buttons have the holes turned the same direction. That's up to you, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. So normally if we were to sew a button onto fabric with the sewing needle, we would put a little knot into the end of our thread. Except in this case, since we're working into knitting, if we put a knot in the end of this yarn and expected it not to pull through the fabric, it would definitely pull its way through the fabric. So what we're going to do is, this is how I like to sew buttons onto knitting. I'm going to come up through the first hole and leave a little tail, then go down through the second hole. And I don't want to pull it so hard that the tail comes out because we want that tail to stay there. So I'm going to take a second stitch through my button. All right, now I'm going to turn it over and tie the tail together with my rest of my yarn right here. And I like to tie that in a double knot. So now the button is secure and the tail is secure, but we don't have to worry about the knot in the tail coming through the fabric because it is tied together with the rest of the yarn. All right, so now we're going to work our way to the position of the next button, which is right here. I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to start kind of weaving my yarn through the back of this garter stitch fabric. I'm just going along here and splitting each strand as I go through it, or go past it, I should say. All right, so then I want to make sure that when I weave that through that I don't pull it too tight because I don't want to cinch the edge of that too tight. We want it to lay flat. So right here is where our two lines intersect at the edging. I'm going to place another button centered right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch this button down. And I'm only taking 2 stitches through each button because these are, we're going through the buttons with yarn. So it's kind of thick compared to the size of the buttonholes, or the holes in the buttons, I should say. So there's my first stitch. And then I'm going to take a second stitch. Like so. And now what we're going to do is we need to secure this button to make sure it doesn't come loose. So I'm going to turn the edge over, take a very small strand, or like a single strand with my needle, wrap the yarn around the needle, and pull it through to make a knot. And now we're going to continue weaving this button sewing on yarn through the back of the garter stitch until we get to the place where we're going to put the next button. All right, so now that we're at the point for the next button, I'm going to turn it back over, sew the next button on, and continue attaching buttons all the way across until I get to the last one. All right, so now that all our buttons are sewn on, all I have left to do is to weave in the tail at each end, and then our wrap is finished. So with the way that the buttons are spaced versus the buttonholes, if you want to, you can attach the buttons and they will line up with the ones at the other end. But if you want to button through the holes that are on the side, then you'll need to either put one button through each hole, and that will give you a slightly gathered effect on this piece. and that can help it to kind of drape a little extra if you want it to be really drapey. Or if you want it to be more smooth and flat, then you can put a button through every other hole in the side edges. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.